Today I'm doing the other panel for the sport brief or boxer brief. I'm doing the piecing the side panels together today, or right now. To do the construction scene, I'm using this small lightning bolt zigzag stretch stitch on my machine, a Brother CE1100. It's an inexpensive machine from Walmart, the Project Runway edition. It's a very good machine. Got it for about $100. It does super well with knits. I don't have to use a specialty foot. I do, however, when I start lightweight knits, I do have to use a little bit of tissue paper on the needle plate and then put my fabric on top of this. It helps keep lightweight knits from being pulled down the needle hole. But that's pretty much an issue with any sewing machine and lightweight knits. In this machine, being an inexpensive model, they don't have any specialty needle plates you can order. Just the basic one that came with the machine. Now I'm hoping to get a 3D printer sometime this year. If I do, I'm going to be coming up with an incredible amount of specialty items for my sewing machine. Like a needle plate for just doing straight stitching, or using the zigzag foot here with a very, very small needle hole. People ask me, well, what items could you use, in the real world for a 3D printer and sewing? I'm like, a better camera holder, better needle, better thread spool holders, better guide clips for the top of the machine for thread to go through. I have a list of like 10 different items that I could probably easily design in a 3D software to print out for specialty tools for sewing. But I'm afraid if I get a 3D printer, I'll get addicted to 3D printing and not do much sewing. Kind of defeating the idea of getting a 3D printer to make specialty stuff for sewing. And what I'm doing is I'm just sewing all the panel pieces together, and then I'm going to top stitch them afterwards. And this is the side panel, this is the rear panel, side stripes, and then the front thigh panel. And if you've been following how I make boxer briefs and sport briefs, I like panel construction versus trying to use one piece of fabric to go all the way around the body. even though people are like, oh, well, it's stretch fabric, it'll work. You can only expect so much from stretch fabric. Like the sewing machine here, think that this is like your hip or kneecap. You're asking the fabric to stretch this way, diagonally. And that's quite a bit from fabric, even though it says it's a 4-way stretch. So what seams do when you add seams and panels is you add a place where the stress can come off the fabric and hit the seam and make the whole garment lay a little bit better on the body than trying to get one piece of fabric to go all the way around and twist around. That's what people have with the raglan t-shirt patterns. The armpit tends to get a scrunch in the armpit, up in the pit. It's because you're asking the fabric to go all the way over here from the neckline down the arm and then bunch up underneath in the armpit. I have a raglan pattern that is a raglan sleeve, but it has like a armpit gusset. Makes a much better looking raglan t-shirt or raglan shirt. Just requires the construction takes a little bit more time than a regular raglan. If you do like a regular raglan, it's a 4-piece pattern, not counting what you're going to do for the collar and the armholes. But basic construction of the bodice pieces is a 4-piece, a front piece and back piece, and then 2 identical sleeves. So the construction of it's minimal seams. But then again, when you go put it on, I'd call minimum standard of quality of looking. And it doesn't matter what kind of stretch fabric you use, you're still asking the fabric to do a whole lot more than it should. But with what I call technique and methodology, you could take a regular raglan pattern and with a little bit of panel construction and a gusset, make it look and feel a whole lot better. Now, I tend to not be constrained with my sewing by time, because I tend to only sew when I feel like I have plenty of enough time and nothing else to do. So it gives me a little more of an advantage. But if you're one of the persons that's a little more busier and needs to make something a little quicker, some of my techniques and methodologies probably won't work so well for you. And I'm using bulky nylon in the bobbin thread. Even though I'm using a stretch stitch, using bulky nylon will give me just a little bit extra stretch. And since I'm using apparel scuba knit fabric, which has probably around a 15% stretch, and it's going to be a fairly fitted pair of shorts, any little extra bit for stretchiness in the seams, because you don't want them to pop. But the technique I'm doing for the build of this is to do the construction seams. This is the front of the garment without top stitching. This is the reverse side of the garment. I'm using a 3/8 inch seam allowance because these are going to be a tight fitting sport brief, not really underwear, sport brief where you can kind of wear them in public if you want, or want to play sports in them, go swimming in them. So I'm using a 3/8 inch seam allowance to give me a little bit of extra fabric to sew my top stitching on.
We lost the frisbee.
And then when you do the top stitching, you do it from the front, you finger open the back, so it's an open seam, finger pressed open seam. And this apparel knit fabric is a bottom weight of 300, about, I think minimum was a 325. I think the red was a 345, and the black is a 325 GSM. So I can get away with starting this one without having to put the tissue paper underneath it. The top stitching on this one, I'm using the honeycomb at a stitch width of 7 and a length of 2.5. It kind of gives me the best look I'm looking for. That's similar to like a reverse cover stitch. Up close, it looks like a honeycomb, but from a couple of feet away on a garment, on a leggings or a sport brief or underwear, it looks kind of just like a reverse cover stitch. Maybe a little nicer than a reverse cover stitch. I lock stitch a little bit on the first stitch. Then you go under here and make sure it's finger pressed open. And then top stitch down. And using the bulky nylon, you cannot sew really quick with it, otherwise you're gonna shred the bulky nylon thread. Which for me, it's not that big of a deal because I tend to be a very slow sewer anyhow. But if you're one that likes to sew at a better speed, you could just stick with regular thread in your bobbin. I know people are like, well, why are you using the honeycomb stitch for top stitching? Because I want to give the kind of the look of a reverse cover stitch. And I'm doing this on a home sewing machine. Most of the people in these particular groups I'm doing this video for and garment builds for have home sewing machines, not a serger and definitely not a cover stitch machine. I do have a serger / cover stitch combo. But I do builds and videos for that over there at that, and I try and stick just with a home sewing machine for this group. because that's what most people have. I have this decorative stitch on my machine. It's an unnamed one, but it's stitch 52 on my machine. That really looks like almost identical to a reverse cover stitch. But I'm using the honeycomb because almost everybody has a honeycomb stitch. Not everybody has a number 52 deco stitch. But every manufacturer, and even different model lines in a manufacturer, have a bunch of different decorative stitches. Now the honeycomb and my stitch number 52 also have stretch to them. So this works good as top stitching on sports fabric, especially the honeycomb. Probably has the most amount of stretch. So it not only looks like a reverse cover stitch, it has a performance similar to it. I haven't done a comparison of side by side, but just from making several garments with each method, I would say that the honeycomb reverse cover stitch look, the functionality is slightly less stretchy than the cover stitch on my cover stitch machine. But I'm using scuba apparel knit, which has not as much stretch as a regular nylon or spandex cotton. So I'm making a fitted garment, so it's well within the slightly less stretchiness using the honeycomb stitch. And that's what the honeycomb stitch looks like for top stitching. This is the exterior of the garment. Close up, you can kind of see the red kind of looks like a zigzaggy kind of thing. But from a couple feet away, it still kind of looks like a reverse cover stitch. Then the inside of this looks almost identical to the exterior. And these are my seam allowances. In this garment, I don't mind the little bit of extra fabric. Because there are going to be a pair of sport briefs. Finger pressed open the seam in the bottom. Get all these threads out of the way. Like I said, I lock stitch the first stitch a little bit. Then I bury the needle down, adjust my fabric, make sure it's finger pressed open on the bottom. And I should have checked my bobbin for thread. This top stitching with a decorative stitch uses a lot of thread. On a serger, when you use the cover stitch, you've got the cones to pull from, but when you're top stitching and with the decorative stitch in a home sew machine, all that you have is that tiny little bobbin. Now for my needle thread, I'm just using regular serger cone thread. I haven't tried the maxi lock stretch comb thread. It's next on my list to try out and do a comparison to regular thread for my sportswear garment and activewear garment builds. But I've yet to have one of these type of seams I'm making here with a lightning bolt stretch stitch as a construction and then doing a decorative top stitching over it, pop open. Tends to be a very strong seam when you're done with it. Sometimes for construction I use the triple stitch stretch. That's where it goes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, then 2 steps forward. But I find I just like the little lightning bolt stretch stitch better. Yeah, got plenty of bobbin thread still. Now, if I was trying to save time and making a garment for myself, I'd probably serge these seams and use the cover stitch. But if I was making this for a client, I'd just be using my home sew machine and these type of stitches. Because if you're going to do a garment for a client, there's always the constraints of speed, but you also want get the quality of the finished garment to be the best you can. And I feel I just have a little bit better control with the sewing machine than the serger cover stitch. Now when you're using the decorative stitching, you don't want to pull or try and push or hold back the fabric. You want to let the machine do as much of the feeding as possible, so the stitches come out as even as possible. Doing these long straight stitches on the side panels, it would show really, really loudly if you mess up the spacing of them. So you let the machine do the feeding as much as possible. Of course, with knit fabric, you need to make sure you're not getting any puckers or one side's not creeping more than the other. Especially since this is a 345 and this is a 325. The feed dogs want to feed this side slightly different than this side. So you have to really guide the fabric in, but not hold it back or push it in. And then guiding it, for this particular project, guiding it from back here and not putting tension on it, but just a tiny little bit of tension, probably half of what would be considered finger tension, or a third of what you'd consider finger tension. Somewhere along the line when I was doing this, I bumped the machine and I switched off from stitch 18 to stitch 8 up here. But there's no way to unpick this, and I don't feel like recutting this entire side panel. So it's going to be a last minute design change I'm going to leave in place. I'll show you in a minute. The buttons on my machine to change it are these 4 right here. They're really, really easy to bump. Take a look at how bad that looks. Here's the number 18 stitch. And right here I bumped it and it switched over to a number 8 stitch. Can't really tell too much. And then down here I switched back to the 18. So this 10 inches or so is going to be slightly different stitch. Not enough that I'm going to pull it out and worry about it, because probably nobody will ever notice it other than me. Now if this was a piece for a client, obviously this whole panel would be scrapped and have to be redone. But that's just part of the process when you make couture clothing, is that occasionally you make mistakes. Sometimes it can be more problematic than others if you have a limited amount of specialty fabric. This particular fabric I have here is available 24/7 from a couple of different vendors. So, no problem if I wanted to recut this entire side panel, I could. Now, if I were to do that, I wouldn't throw any of this away. I'd incorporate this into another brief pattern or something. I wouldn't throw any of it out. Just repurpose it into a different sportswear garment. So not the end of the world I messed this one up. Or not the end of the world if I had to redo it. And then when I'm done with these two side panels, I'm going to be laying them out on my cutting board and doing some measurements. I'm making these for me, so I'm going to be making them precisely to my waist measurements. So I may have to trim it up, or just, because I know it's just slightly larger, so it's very well fitted. If this was a regular cotton lycra or cotton spandex with like 40% stretch, I've just made it a little smaller and just let the stretch do the fitting. But this fabric's not got that much stretch, so I'm going to have to make sure, even before I do the crotch seam and the rear seat seam, that the panels are the right size. There we go, this panel's done. See, from a distance away, you can't tell that this is a different stitch than this one. Try and get it all in focus. It's the exterior. This is up by the waistband up here. Then the stripes flare out a little bit toward the bottom for the legs. This is the interior. All the seams are pressed open, sewn flat with the decorative stitch. Will lay nice and flat on the body. Has plenty of stretch.